Story 1. The Echo of a Glitch. The digital art studio where I worked, Pixel Pulse, was a sanctuary of creativity in the heart of Seattle. I'm Maya Sharma, a 32-year-old lead graphic designer. My life was a well-ordered canvas of code, color palettes, and caffeine. I had a good career, a cozy apartment, and a stable routine. But the quiet rhythm of my life was about to be disrupted by a single, inexplicable event. It started with a seemingly harmless glitch. One Tuesday morning, I was working on a complex digital illustration for a major client. Suddenly, my monitor flickered, and the screen was momentarily filled with a cascade of strange symbols and an almost subliminal, distorted face. It was gone in an instant, replaced by my usual desktop. I shrugged it off, attributing it to a software bug. But then, as I was walking to my favorite coffee shop, a woman in a dark gray trench coat and sunglasses bumped into me. She didn't say a word, just stared at me with an unsettlingly blank expression before walking away. The incident was bizarre but not alarming. The next day, however, as I was presenting my design to the team, my tablet glitched again, displaying the same distorted face and symbols. Her colleague Alex, a quiet and observant developer, noticed my disturbed reaction and asked if I was okay. I told him about the glitch, and he laughed it off, saying it was probably a harmless virus. But the unsettling feeling persisted. The following week, the glitches became more frequent. My phone, my laptop, and even the smart TV in my apartment would flicker, displaying the same unsettling symbols and face. It felt personal, as if something was trying to reach me through my devices. Then the harassment began. I started receiving anonymous emails filled with strings of binary code and fragmented images of an unknown location. I tried to block the sender, but the emails kept coming from new, untraceable addresses. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My sense of security began to erode. I felt a growing sense of paranoia, constantly checking over my shoulder, convinced that someone was following me. The digital world that had once been my playground had now become a source of profound anxiety. The harassment reached a terrifying new level when I received a package at my doorstep. There was no return address. Inside, nestled in a bed of shredded paper, was a single old-fashioned music box. It was beautiful, but when I opened it, it didn't play a melody. Instead, it played a distorted, static-filled recording of what sounded like my own voice, muffled and panicked. It was a recording I didn't recognize, and it sent a cold shiver down my spine. It felt like a deliberate, cruel violation of my privacy. I felt like I was losing control, that the strange digital intrusion was now leaking into my physical world. I couldn't escape it. The climax of this strange ordeal occurred when I received a voice message from an unknown number. The voice, heavily distorted, called me by name and informed me that my digital footprint, my photos, my conversations, my personal data had been uploaded to a hidden server. The voice told me that this was the work of an echo, a digital entity created to settle old scores. The voice offered to delete the data for a large sum of untraceable digital currency. I was in a state of sheer panic. I had no idea who was doing this or why, but I knew I couldn't risk my entire life being exposed online. After a few days of agonizing silence, during which my paranoia intensified, I received another call. It was a colleague, Alex. He told me he was leaving the company, and then, in a casual, almost offhand tone, he said, "I know what you did." The line went dead. A sudden, chilling realization hit me. A few months ago, I had been asked to choose a team member to let go due to budget cuts. I had chosen Alex because his quiet demeanor often came across as a lack of passion. I had regretted the decision, but I never thought it would lead to this. The silence from him after I heard his voice on the phone was the final confirmation. He had orchestrated this entire campaign against me, not for money, but for a twisted form of revenge. I had no choice but to pay the ransom to the Echo. The attack stopped, and the digital haunting ceased. The silence was a new kind of terror, the terror of a wound that had been inflicted and then left to fester. I realized how fragile my life was, and how easily someone could use the digital world to ruin a person's life. I left my job, moved to a new city, and wiped my online presence clean. The experience left me with a deep-seated fear of technology, of the unseen threats that lurk in the digital shadows. My life was no longer my own. It was a ghost in the machine, an echo of a glitch that I could never fully erase. Story 2. The Phantom Reel. The abandoned Sterling Heights Conservatory was a forgotten relic, a grand building of brick and ivy that stood silent on a hill, overlooking the desolate industrial town of Port Sterling. For Julian Reed, a 35-year-old freelance sound designer, it was a siren call. Julian's life was a pursuit of the perfect sound, the rustle of a forgotten leaf, the unique echo in a vacant hallway, the quiet hum of a distant electrical current. His motivation was to create soundscapes that felt alive, that told a story without a single word. He saw the conservatory not as a ruin, but as a masterpiece of ambient noise waiting to be captured. Julian arrived on a chilly, overcast morning, his audio recorder and sensitive microphones in hand. The air inside the conservatory was heavy with the scent of damp wood and decaying plaster. Every step he took on the grand marble staircase sent a deep, groaning echo through the vast, empty halls. He recorded the quiet symphony of the building, the faint drip of water, the low moan of the wind through a broken window pane, the ghostly creak of a distant door. He was in his element, a hunter of unheard melodies. As he explored the deserted offices, he found a small, dusty storeroom at the very back of the building. It was filled with discarded furniture and forgotten instruments. In a corner, half hidden beneath a pile of old sheet music, was a vintage reel-to-reel tape recorder. It was a beautiful, well-preserved machine, a relic from a different era. The tape was still on the spool, and it was unlabeled. He felt an intense, almost magnetic pull towards it. It was a found treasure, a piece of the past that might hold a unique sound. He carefully took the machine and the tape, a sense of quiet triumph washing over him. The vendor he passed on the way out, a janitor who gave him a strange look, told him that the place was cursed, that it held a sound that would never leave you. Julian dismissed it as local folklore, the ramblings of a man who spent too much time in the silence. He returned to his small modern apartment, his excitement bubbling over. Back in the pristine white of his home studio, Julian placed the reel-to-reel recorder on his work desk. The afternoon light cast a gentle glow on the machine. He set up his audio equipment, and with a mix of anticipation and trepidation, he pressed the play button. The tape whirred to life, but the sound that came out was not music. It was a series of ambient noises, much like the ones he had recorded himself. He heard the faint sound of wind, the distant creak of a door. But then, a subtle, almost imperceptible sound broke through the static, a whisper. He turned up the volume, and the whisper became clearer, more distinct. It was a single word, spoken in a voice that was both familiar and alien. His own name. He felt a shiver run down his spine. The whisper was followed by other sounds he couldn't place. Sounds of movement, as if someone was walking in an empty room, and the soft, almost panicked rustle of paper. He fast-forwarded the tape, his hands trembling. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. and now he could hear a voice, a distorted version of his own, saying, "They're here. They know." He began to feel a creeping sense of paranoia. He heard a faint creak from the hallway outside his apartment, a sound identical to the one on the tape. He checked his phone, and an unknown text message appeared on the screen, a single binary string that he couldn't decipher. It felt as though the sounds from the tape were not just echoes of the past, but signals, messages that were leaking into his present. The paranoia intensified over the next few days. Every quiet moment was filled with the phantom whispers from the tape. He started receiving strange emails, digital notes filled with fragmented images of the conservatory, and strings of code that mirrored the binary on his phone. He felt as if his digital world was being invaded, manipulated by an unknown force. He was convinced that the tape was not a record of a soundscape, but a living entity, a sentient curse that had been passed on to him. The climax came when he discovered a hidden message on the tape itself, written in an almost invisible ink on the back of the reel. It was a chilling confession from the previous owner, a reclusive cartographer who had once lived in the town. He had a theory that he could capture the echoes of events and emotions, not just sound, and had built the recorder to prove his theory. But his experiment had gone wrong. The machine had not just recorded the echoes, it had created a phantom of him, a digital ghost that had trapped him in a world of his own making. The note ended with a desperate warning. "Don't try to erase the echoes. They are not sounds. They are us. You can't destroy what you've become." Julian felt his blood run cold. He was not just a discoverer of the tape. He was the next subject, the next victim. The phantom voice on the tape was not the cartographer's, but his own. A desperate echo from a future he was already entering. He tried to throw the recorder away, to break it, to silence the whispers. But the machine resisted, feeling heavier and colder in his hands. He felt a profound sense of helplessness. The more he tried to fight, the louder the whispers became. The more distorted the images on his devices became. He realized that the reel-to-reel recorder was not just an artifact. It was a cage. He was trapped in a terrifying psychological loop. The story of the phantom sounds wasn't just a discovery. It was a warning from a past that was now his present. He was the next chapter in the cartographer's terrible story, and there was no way out. The whispers were all around him, and he could hear his own voice, distorted and panicked, echoing back at him from the silence. Story 3, Shadowlands. A cold, persistent drizzle was washing over the old city of Willow Creek, turning the cobblestone streets to polished obsidian. It was the kind of gray, dreary afternoon that made you want to stay inside with a book and a mug of something hot. But for Elias Vance, a young urban archivist with a passion for lost history, the weather was a call to adventure. He was on his way to an antique shop on the edge of the city, a place known as the Curious Compendium, after hearing a rumor about a collection of forgotten journals. The shop was a labyrinth of shadows and dust, a place where time seemed to slow to a crawl. The air was thick with the scent of decaying paper and old wood. Elias, a man in his late 20s, with a serious demeanor and a sharp, focused gaze, was searching through a row of cluttered shelves when a strange item caught his eye. It wasn't a book or a journal. It was a small, intricately carved wooden box, sitting alone on a high shelf in a dimly lit corner. The box was made of a dark, unfamiliar wood and was adorned with strange, swirling patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the dim light. It didn't look like an antique, but rather something older, more primal. Its surface was smooth and cool to the touch, and there was no lock, no latch, just a faint seam running around its center. He felt an inexplicable pull towards the box, a deep curiosity that gnawed at him. He took it down, his fingers tracing the strange carvings. It was deceptively light, almost hollow, yet it felt as if it held a great weight. He found the shopkeeper, an elderly man with a long white beard and tired eyes, and asked about the box. The man simply shrugged and said he'd found it among a donation of old furniture from an estate sale and hadn't thought much of it. He sold it to Elias for a handful of dollars, seeming relieved to be rid of it. The casual indifference of the shopkeeper was unsettling, as if the object held no value, no story, no mystery. Elias returned to his apartment, the box clutched tightly in his hands. Back in the warm, dry air of his small modern apartment, Elias placed the box on his coffee table. The afternoon light filtering through the window seemed to dim as he focused on the object. He pressed his thumb against the faint seam, and with a soft click, the top of the box opened. Inside, there was no treasure, no jewelry, no ancient scroll. Instead, the box contained a single, perfectly preserved glass vial filled with a dark, shimmering liquid. But what truly sent a shiver down Elias's spine was the small, folded note that lay beside it. It was not old or yellowed with age, but fresh, written in what looked like a fine point pen. It contained a single chilling phrase in elegant looping script. "This is the last piece of the puzzle. Do not drink it." The note was a direct and personal warning, a message intended for him. But how could a note placed in a box from an antique shop be meant specifically for him? Elias's mind raced. He had an unusual, recurring dream, more like a fragmented memory, of being in a strange, silent forest, searching for something he could never quite find. The memory was always accompanied by a strange, throbbing sensation in his left arm, right at the wrist. He had assumed it was just a vivid dream, a quirk of his subconscious. But now, seeing the note, he felt a jolt of recognition. The strange, swirling patterns on the box were identical to a faint scar he had on his left wrist. The throbbing sensation started again, a phantom pain he had always dismissed. Elias began to obsessively research the symbols on the box. He spent hours in his archive, cross-referencing ancient texts and forgotten lore. He discovered that the patterns were part of a long-lost language, a dialect of a forgotten civilization known as the Veiled Ones. The liquid in the vial was a component in a ritual meant to access a hidden reality, a shadow realm that coexisted with their own. He found fragmented records of people who had attempted the ritual, all of them ending in a similar, terrifying way. They would disappear from this world, their bodies remaining, but their minds and souls vanished. But there was another, more sinister detail. The ritual required 3 pieces to be completed, a trio of seemingly unrelated artifacts that, when brought together, could open a permanent gateway between the 2 realities. Elias returned to his apartment, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. The box and the vial were a part of something far greater and more terrifying than he could have imagined. He laid the note on his desk, its warning echoing in his mind. He looked at the vial, the shimmering liquid within, and felt an overwhelming sense of dread. But then he remembered his dream, the feeling of searching, the scar on his wrist. It was as if a part of him was already intertwined with this shadow realm, as if he was fated to be a part of this ancient, horrifying ritual. He was both the discoverer and the target. The note was not a warning from a stranger. It was a desperate plea from someone who had already attempted the ritual and failed. He realized with a chilling certainty that the person who wrote the note was not just warning him, but also trying to complete the ritual through him. The note, the box, the vial, they were not just artifacts, they were lures. The throbbing in his wrist intensified, a rhythmic pulse that matched the frantic beat of his heart. Elias was faced with an impossible choice. He could destroy the box and the vial, severing the link and leaving the mystery unsolved. Or he could continue his research, risking his sanity, his reality, and his very soul to uncover the truth. He looked at his wrist, the faint scar now seeming to glow with a faint, malevolent light. He picked up the vial, his fingers trembling. The liquid inside seemed to call to him, to whisper promises of answers, of knowledge beyond his wildest dreams. He knew, in his gut, that he was being guided, manipulated, and that the person who left the box was not a victim, but a perpetrator, someone who wanted him to complete the ritual. He had to know who, and he had to know why. And the only way to find out was to take the first step towards a journey from which there might be no return. The line between reality and the Shadowlands was blurring, and Elias was standing on the precipice. He felt an intense wave of dread and paranoia wash over him, knowing he was already in too deep. The story wasn't just about a box. It was about the slow, insidious unraveling of his own reality. Story 4: The Ledger of Shadows. Her life was spent meticulously cataloging old documents, digitizing dusty records, and breathing life into forgotten stories. She had recently moved to Lakeside Creek, a small picturesque town in rural Vermont, a place where time seemed to move at a more respectful pace. She was motivated by a desire to escape the frantic pace of the city and immerse herself in a community with a deep, rich history. She had taken up a volunteer position at the local historical society, a charmingly disorganized building, filled with the scent of old paper and well-oiled wood. The annual town festival was her first major public event. The town green was a hive of activity, with stalls selling homemade crafts, local produce, and historical trinkets. As Clara was arranging a display of old maps and photographs, her attention was caught by a heated argument a few stalls down. It wasn't a loud, angry shouting match, but a low, tense exchange between two people who were clearly on opposite sides of a deeply personal issue. It was an elderly man, Mr. Abernathy, a stern, well-known town elder, and a young woman, Lily, a new-to-town artist with a reputation for being fiercely independent. They were arguing over a single old leather-bound book. The book, faded with age and worn at the edges, was a town ledger, a record of births, deaths, and significant local events. Mr. Abernathy was gesturing angrily at the book, his face a mask of frustration and fear. "You have no right to this," he insisted, his voice trembling with emotion. "It belongs to my family. It's not for public eyes." Lily, however, held her ground. "It's a historical document, Mr. Abernathy," she countered, her voice calm but firm. "It's part of this town's story. It belongs to all of us." The argument grew more intense as people started to gather, drawn by the palpable tension. Mr. Abernathy's face grew pale, and he clutched at his chest, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. He made a desperate, chilling statement. "This isn't a book, child. It's a record of a debt, a balance that must be paid." In a fit of frustration, Lily snatched the ledger and threw it to the ground. It landed with a heavy thud, and at that very moment, Mr. Abernathy let out a long, painful gasp and collapsed to his knees. The festive atmosphere evaporated instantly, replaced by a stunned, horrifying silence. A few people rushed to help Mr. Abernathy, yelling for someone to call for help. Clara, frozen by the suddenness of the event, could only watch as the old man's face turned an ashen gray. Paramedics arrived quickly, and they worked on him, but it was clear from their solemn expressions that things were very bad. He was rushed to the hospital, and a few hours later, the town's pastor announced that he had passed away. He was only in his 70s, a man known for his kindness and his deep knowledge of the town's history. And now, he was gone, all because of an argument over a book. The town was in a state of collective shock and grief. The police took the ledger into evidence, and the case was officially closed as a tragic medical event. But for Clara, the mystery remained. What was so important about that book? What did Mr. Abernathy mean by a debt and a balance? She couldn't shake the feeling that the ledger was somehow the key to everything. She went to the Historical Society's archives and started to meticulously cross-reference the ledger's contents with other town records. She found that it wasn't just a ledger. It was a record of the town's most tragic events, each one recorded with a cryptic symbol and a date. The events were a strange mix of seemingly random accidents, a barn fire that had no clear cause, a mysterious illness that had afflicted a whole family, a series of failed harvests that had left the town on the brink of ruin. She felt a wave of icy terror as she realized that the dates on the ledger weren't just a record of the past. They were a roadmap of the town's collective misfortunes. The real horror began when she found a connection to her own family. Her family's old home had been destroyed by a fire decades ago, a fire that was a total mystery to the town's fire department. She found a faint entry in the ledger, a new symbol next to the date of the fire. It was a different, more recent hand that had scribbled the entry. She felt her blood run cold as she realized that the ledger was not just a record of the past. It was a living, breathing document, a curse that was passed down from one person to the next. The mystery wasn't just about an old man's death. It was a terrifying, deeply personal story that was now becoming her own. She began to hear whispers in the archives, and every creak of the old floorboards seemed to whisper her name. She felt like she was a part of something far older and more sinister than she could have ever imagined. Clara was faced with a horrifying dilemma. She couldn't just throw the ledger away. It was too deeply connected to her. She had to understand it to find out who the new scribe was. She meticulously reread the journal, searching for any clues about the scribe who had left it. She found a fragmented, scribbled note on the very last page, a plea from the last person who had owned the journal. It was a warning, a desperate cry for help. It spoke of a person who had become obsessed with them, a reclusive man who believed that by documenting someone's life, he could take control of it. The note mentioned his name, but it was smudged and illegible. She called her friend Liam, a journalist with a knack for research. She told him about the journal, the entries, and the terrifying new prophecy. He was skeptical at first, but after she read him some of the entries, he began to believe her. He went to the local library and looked up the history of her house and the previous owners. He discovered that the last person to live there was a reclusive author who had a reputation for being obsessed with his subjects. He had died in the house a few months ago, and all his belongings had been sold at an estate sale. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The journal wasn't just a record. It was a part of the author's twisted legacy, a way for him to continue his macabre work even after death. Alara realized that she wasn't just a character in his story. She was the last chapter, the final subject he had chosen. And she knew that the only way to break the curse was to find the last piece of the puzzle, the lock that the rusted key belonged to. The journal was not a gift of foresight. It was a chain, a trap designed to lead her to her own demise. She looked at the key in her hand, the rust now seeming to glow with a faint, malevolent light, and she knew she had a decision to make: to follow the curse to its end, or to fight back against the unseen force that was controlling her life. Story 5. The Gilded Compass. Simon Avery was a man of quiet precision. After years of charting volatile, unpredictable seas, he had sought solace in a life of meticulous order. He had settled in the sleepy coastal town of Pinnacle Bay, a place of gentle sea breezes and ancient cobblestone streets. His days were now spent in a small, organized workshop where he meticulously restored antique maps and navigational tools. His motivation was to find a sense of control and predictability in the delicate lines of a forgotten world, a stark contrast to the chaotic career he had left behind. His peaceful routine was unexpectedly interrupted by a local community event, an annual Maritime Treasures Fair held on the town's historic wharf. Simon, drawn by the promise of rare historical artifacts, went with a quiet sense of professional curiosity. The fair was a bustle of activity, with stalls overflowing with brass telescopes, ancient sextants, and brittle, salt-stained charts. As he was browsing a table filled with old diving helmets and ship's logs, his attention was caught by a peculiar object. It was a small, ornate compass, its frame made of tarnished, gilded brass. Its face had no cardinal points, but was etched with a series of strange, unsettling symbols that seemed to shift and shimmer in the light. The needle, a thin sliver of polished obsidian, spun wildly, never settling on a single direction. He felt an intense pull towards it, a fascination that bordered on obsession. He was not the only one. Another man, a young, frantic antique collector named Tobias, stood beside him, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and desperation. "You can't have that," Tobias whispered, his voice trembling with a raw, undeniable anxiety. "It's not for sale. It's a family heirloom." The vendor, an elderly woman with kind, tired eyes, looked confused. "Heirloom? I bought it from a salvage auction," she said, her voice gentle. "It was part of a crate from the old lighthouse." The argument grew more intense, but it was not about money or ownership. It was about something far more chilling. "It's a curse," Tobias insisted, his voice rising, his body tense. "It doesn't point north. It points to a final destination. Every person who has held it, they're gone." The vendor tried to de-escalate the situation, but Tobias's desperation was palpable. In a fit of frantic desperation, he lunged for the compass. The peaceful atmosphere of the fair evaporated instantly. Simon, startled by the sudden violence, instinctively held the compass tighter. In the ensuing struggle, Tobias stumbled, his feet getting tangled in a frayed rope. He lost his balance, his arms flailing, and he crashed into a nearby table, sending a cascade of old brass bells and chains clattering to the ground. He fell with a sickening thud, and the compass flew from Simon's grasp, landing face up on the worn wooden planks of the wharf. The obsidian needle, which had been spinning madly, now stopped. Tobias laid on the ground, his eyes wide with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. He wasn't looking at the small cut on his hand, a wound from a jagged piece of glass that had broken off the compass face. He was staring at the needle, which was now perfectly still. He let out a long, painful gasp and clutched his chest, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. The horror wasn't the physical injury. It was the look on his face, a look that said he had just seen his own end, that the compass had finally found its target. Paramedics arrived quickly and worked on Tobias, but their solemn faces told the story. He was rushed to the hospital, and a few hours later, the police announced that he had passed away from what appeared to be a heart attack. The case was officially closed as a tragic medical event, but for Simon, the mystery remained. The compass was taken as evidence, and he felt a profound sense of guilt and an overwhelming need to understand. He couldn't shake the image of Tobias's face, a face twisted in a fear that transcended the physical. What did the young man mean by final destination? He went to the local historical society's archives and started to meticulously cross-reference Tobias's name with local maritime history. He found that Tobias wasn't a local, but had a distant family connection to the town's seafaring past. He found a strange, recurring pattern in the old ship's logs, a series of tragic, seemingly unrelated accidents, all of which had involved a single, mysterious, gilded compass. The logs described sudden storms, mysterious navigational errors, and a series of disappearances at sea. The details were too specific to be a coincidence. The real horror began when he found a connection to his own life. The compass had been on display at the same table where he had been standing. Tobias had lunged at him, and he had held it. The more he researched, the more he found chilling similarities to the accidents he had miraculously survived during his own career. He felt a wave of icy terror as he realized that the compass wasn't just a record of the past. It was a living, breathing document, a curse that was passed down from one person to the next. The mystery wasn't just about a young man's death. It was a terrifying, deeply personal story that was now becoming his own. He began to hear faint, almost imperceptible whispers in his workshop, and every gust of wind from the sea seemed to whisper his name. He felt like he was a part of something far older and more sinister than he could have ever imagined. The compass, which he had so eagerly sought, was not a gift of history. It was a chain, a trap, designed to lead him to his own demise. He looked at the compass, its gilded frame now seeming to glow with a faint, malevolent light, and he knew he had a decision to make: to follow the curse to its end, or to fight back against the unseen force that was controlling his life. Story 6. The Drone's Echo. His motivation was to capture the unique, silent stories that old buildings and abandoned structures held. He saw beauty in decay and a unique form of art in the natural sounds of a place that had been left to the elements. He had recently moved to Midvale City, a sprawling metropolis with a forgotten past, a vast network of decommissioned subway tunnels and abandoned industrial zones that were a gold mine for his work. His current project was the infamous Midvale Central Annex, a subway station that had been shut down decades ago after a mysterious collapse. It was a local legend, a place whispered about in hushed tones by other explorers. Ethan arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, his bag filled with high-end audio recording equipment and cameras. He navigated the labyrinthine tunnels with ease, his headlamp cutting a solitary beam through the inky blackness. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and coal dust, a stark contrast to the humid, bustling city above. He spent hours recording, capturing the distant metallic groans of the city's active subway lines and the faint, almost imperceptible drip of water from the ceiling. He was in his element, a hunter of the unheard. His quiet professional solitude was shattered when he stumbled upon a maintenance room. The door was heavy and rusty, but it opened with a protesting creak. Inside, on a cluttered workbench, was a strange metal device with a series of blinking lights and a faded logo, Midvale Urban Mapping Initiative. It looked like some kind of an old automated drone. It was an intriguing find, a relic from a project long since abandoned. Driven by his insatiable curiosity, Ethan reached out and flipped a small corroded switch on the side of the device. With a faint electrical hum, the device's lights flickered to life. Then, with a sudden, jarring whir, a pair of rotors spun to life and the drone lifted off the workbench. At first, it was a source of fascination. The small, silent drone hovered in the air, its single red light blinking rhythmically. It seemed harmless, almost like a lost pet, but then as he began to move, the drone followed him, its movements erratic and unpredictable. A faint, low-frequency buzzing began to fill the air, a sound he couldn't place. He tried to ignore it and continue his work, but the drone's constant presence was a source of growing anxiety. The feeling of being watched, of being followed by a mechanical eye, was deeply unsettling. He tried to leave the room, but the drone hovered in his path, its rotors whirring with an aggressive, insistent tone. He knew this wasn't a toy. This was something else. The situation escalated when a second drone, identical to the first, whirred to life from a dusty corner of the room. Then a third and a fourth. Soon, the room was filled with the low, menacing hum of a dozen drones, their red lights blinking in a synchronized, haunting rhythm. They weren't just following him anymore. They were a group, a small, chaotic swarm that filled the air. They were bumping into each other, ricocheting off the walls, their buzzing a cacophony of white noise that was physically painful to his ears. Ethan, his heart pounding in his chest, felt a deep sense of helplessness. He was trapped. The drones weren't attacking him directly, but their presence was a physical and psychological assault. They were a swarm of buzzing, soulless insects, and he was caught in their nest. The climax came when the drones began to target his equipment. With a sudden, synchronized movement, they swarmed his camera, its lens smashing against a wall, and then his audio recorder, its delicate microphones bending and breaking under the repeated, chaotic impact. They were destroying his life's work. The buzzing was deafening, the blinking lights a disorienting, strobing menace in the dark. He had to escape, to leave the tunnel, to get away from the terrifying mechanical chaos. He scrambled to his feet, trying to navigate the swarm. He found his way out of the maintenance room and ran down the tunnel, the swarm of drones following him, their blinking red lights a terrifying, hypnotic trail in the dark. He wasn't running from a person or an animal, but from a cold, mechanical menace that was both mindless and terrifyingly relentless. He finally reached a power box, a large metal cabinet with a series of rusted levers. He pulled the main lever, and with a sudden, deafening thud, the lights in the tunnel went out, and the buzzing of the drones ceased. The silence was overwhelming. He stumbled out of the tunnel and into the cold gray light of the city. He was unharmed, but the psychological trauma was immense. He had lost all his equipment, but that was a minor detail. The real loss was his sense of safety. He had faced a truly unpredictable and senseless threat, a machine that had no motive, no reason for its aggression, and no way to be reasoned with. He looked back at the dark, silent tunnel, and he knew that he would never feel the same way about urban exploration again. The memory of the buzzing, the blinking red lights, and the terrifying, chaotic swarm of machines would always be with him. A quiet hum in the back of his mind, a reminder that some of the greatest dangers are not in the wild, but in the forgotten corners of the man-made world. Story 7, The Gilded Cage. My name is Leo Vance, and I am a 30-year-old freelance video documentarian. My job is to capture the mundane beauty and hidden drama of everyday life. I find a profound sense of purpose in turning the ordinary into something compelling and memorable. I am motivated by a desire to reveal the unseen, to to show people the world through a different lens. I recently moved to Ethelberg, a city known for its vibrant public art scene and sprawling green spaces. My current project was a documentary on the city's annual Convergence of Art and Nature exhibition, a sprawling open-air gallery in the heart of the city's largest park. The exhibition was a tapestry of artistic innovation. Sculptures of all shapes and sizes were nestled among ancient oaks and carefully manicured lawns. A few visitors, mostly families with small children and art students sketching in notebooks, were wandering around, enjoying the peaceful atmosphere. I was filming a serene, kinetic sculpture made of polished steel and thin, elegant wires. It was designed to move with the slightest breeze, creating a gentle, harmonious soundscape. Its elegant form and tranquil movements were the perfect start to my project. My camera was positioned on a tripod, capturing the subtle dance of metal and wind. My quiet professional solitude was shattered when I noticed a change in one of the other kinetic sculptures. This one, titled The Gilded Cage, was a large, intricate mobile made of dozens of thin, gold-plated blades, each one razor-sharp at the edges. It was supposed to rotate slowly, its blades catching the sun and casting beautiful, shimmering patterns on the ground. But something was wrong. Its movements, once graceful and slow, grew erratic and aggressive. The gentle whirring of the blades morphed into a harsh, metallic whine, like a hive of angry hornets. People began to notice, pointing at the sculpture with a mixture of confusion and unease. Then the blade's movements became violent. The mobile began to spin with an alarming, almost violent speed. Its elegant golden form became a blur, a menacing vortex of shimmering metal. The whine grew into a high-pitched physical assault on the ears. People saw the sculpture's frantic energy and started to back away. A small girl, clutching a red balloon, dropped her toy and screamed as she ran to her mother. But the sculpture didn't stop. It suddenly lurched forward, crashing into a delicate glass statue of a bird. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, the sound a discordant shriek in the once peaceful park. The bird's form was gone, reduced to a pile of glittering shards. The chaos escalated as the sculpture seemed to gain a malevolent intelligence. Its movements became more purposeful, more destructive. It hovered over a small bench where an elderly couple was sitting, its blades spinning with a terrifying proximity. The couple, paralyzed by fear, screamed and tried to get up, but the man stumbled and fell. The sculpture descended, its aggressive whine growing louder. It wasn't touching the man, but its blades were spinning just inches from his face, trapping him on the ground. People were screaming, scattering in every direction, their panicked cries echoing through the park. A park security guard, a burly man who had been directing traffic, ran towards the scene, shouting at the sculpture to stop, to cease its terrifying display. He tried to get in front of the man on the ground to shield him, but his feet got tangled in a rope that was part of the installation. He fell to the ground, and one of the errant blades of the gilded cage nicked his arm. He cried out in pain, clutching his wound, but the sculpture was relentless. It seemed to have found its target. The man on the ground used his arms to shield his face, his body trembling as the blades spun just inches from his eyes. I was filming all of this, my hand shaking, unable to stop it to move. I was a witness, a helpless bystander to a terrifying, senseless act of mechanical rage. Just when I thought it was over, the sculpture's owner, the artist who had created it, came running. He was shouting at the sculpture to stop, and with a swift, panicked motion, he hit an emergency power switch that was hidden at the base of the sculpture. The buzzing stopped. The spinning blade slowed to a gradual, eerie halt. The terrifying silence was overwhelming. The police and paramedics arrived quickly, and they began treating the security guard's injuries before loading him into an ambulance. The man on the ground was physically unharmed, but his face was all recorded, a silent witness to the chaos. The park, once a serene sanctuary, was now a scene of utter devastation, with shattered glass and scattered debris everywhere. My footage of the event was a viral sensation, a chilling record of a beautiful object turning into a weapon. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The artist said it was a mechanical failure, a random glitch, but I didn't believe him. I kept rewatching the footage, studying the sculpture's movements. They weren't random, they were deliberate, purposeful. It was as if the machine had a will of its own, a malevolent spirit trapped within a cage of gold-plated metal. The more I watched, the more I felt a deep sense of unease, a cold dread that followed me everywhere. It's been months since that day, and I can't bring myself to turn off my camera. I keep it running all the time, recording the mundane moments of my life, the quiet solitude of my apartment, the distant sounds of the city. I can't shake the feeling that the sculpture, that gilded cage, wasn't just a machine that malfunctioned. I can't shake the feeling that its anger, its malice, was a living thing, and it's still out there. I'm afraid that one day, my camera will capture something that wasn't there before, something that has been following me all along. The gilded cage was supposed to be a piece of art, a symbol of beauty and innovation. But for me, it was a terrifying symbol of the fragile and unpredictable nature of the world. Story 8. Unsettling Signal. My name is Liam Evans, and I am amateur radio operator and enthusiast. My world is one of static and signals, a symphony of unseen connections and distant voices. I find a profound sense of purpose in the unpredictable nature of the airwaves, the thrill of finding a new, unexpected frequency, a voice from a place that I never expected. My motivation is to discover the hidden narratives of the world, to find the stories that are whispered in the silence between channels. I recently moved to Silverwood Hollow, a small, secluded town in the vast wooded landscapes of Colorado. My current project was to set up a new high-gain antenna to catch distant, low-frequency signals that were impossible to pick up in the city. My quiet professional solitude was shattered on a Friday afternoon. My new antenna was a thing of beauty, a sprawling array of metal that stretched out into the sky. I was in my element, a hunter of the unheard. I was methodically scanning the airwaves, my headphones a shield against the silence of the afternoon. I was searching for the faint, ghostly whispers of old military transmissions, a common fascination among enthusiasts. I was running a simple, automated scan, a program that would log any strange or unexpected transmissions. My peaceful routine was unexpectedly interrupted by a blaring, static-filled signal that was so loud, so jarring, that I almost jumped out of my chair. At first, I thought it was a mechanical error, a short in the equipment. But as I adjusted the dial, the signal didn't change. It just grew louder. It was a chaotic mess of sound, a cacophony of white noise that was physically painful to my ears. I was about to turn it off when I heard something within the noise, something human. It was a voice, a woman's voice, screaming. It wasn't just a scream, it was a shriek of absolute bone-chilling terror. It was a raw, unfiltered expression of pure fear. My heart was pounding in my chest. The signal wasn't just a random static burst. It was a terrifying, deeply personal broadcast. I couldn't just turn it off. I had to understand it. The situation escalated when I heard another voice in the transmission. This one was a man's, low and menacing, a voice that was clearly filled with rage. He was shouting at the woman, his words a stream of anger and frustration. He wasn't just shouting, he was threatening her, his voice a cold, chilling presence in the static. I was a helpless bystander to a terrifying, senseless act of human rage. It was a live broadcast of a crime. It wasn't just an audio recording. It was a live, unfiltered, and deeply personal transmission of a terrible event. My heart was pounding in my chest, and a profound sense of helplessness washed over me. I was a witness, but I was powerless. I was listening to something that was real, something that was happening right now, but I couldn't see it. I immediately called the police, my voice shaking as I tried to explain the situation. The operator on the other end of the line was patient but skeptical. "You're listening to what?" she asked, her voice calm and professional. "Are you sure it's not a prank? A broadcast from a movie?" I insisted that it was real. I explained the technical details, the low frequency, the way the signal was coming in. But to my horror, as I was talking, the signal went dead. The screaming stopped. The menacing voice was gone. The chaotic static was gone. The channel was completely silent. The operator, now more convinced that I was making the prank call, told me to call back if I had more information. They couldn't do anything with what I had given them. Just a panicked, rambling call from a man who heard voices in the static. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just been a witness to a terrible crime. I replayed the audio, studying the voices, searching for any clues, any identifying markers. The voices, the tone, the sheer terror in the woman's voice, it was all too real. But there was nothing else. Just a brief, terrifying glimpse into a private world. Weeks passed, and I kept expecting to hear it again, to find the source of the signal, to hear the woman's voice again. I stopped listening for old military transmissions. Now, my entire focus was on a single, silent gem. Every time I heard a crackle, every time the static shifted, my heart leapt in my throat. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man's voice was still out there, that the crime had been committed. I couldn't shake the feeling that the voice I heard, the anger and the rage, was a living thing, and it was still out there, somewhere. I'm afraid that one day my radio will pick up a new signal, something that wasn't there before, a low, menacing whisper that is speaking directly to me. Story 9. The Whisper on the Line. My name is Eleanor Vance, and I'm a 28-year-old freelance archivist specializing in digitized historical records. My world is one of dusty documents and forgotten narratives, a symphony of unseen connections and distant voices from the past. My motivation is to discover the hidden narratives of the world, to piece together the untold stories from fragments of data. I recently moved to Havenwood, a small, isolated town nestled in the quiet, rolling hills of the Pacific Northwest. My current project was to catalog a vast digital archive of local historical records for the county's historical society. A task that demanded meticulous attention to detail and a keen eye for patterns. My quiet professional solitude was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. I was deep into my work, methodically sorting through digital files, when I stumbled upon a peculiar collection of audio logs. They were from an old defunct telephone exchange that had been in operation in the 1970s. The files were corrupted and filled with static, but a few of them had a strange low-frequency hum that I couldn't place. I ran a simple automated program to clean up the files, a piece of software that was designed to remove static and bring out the human voice. My peaceful routine was unexpectedly interrupted by a blaring, static-filled signal that was so loud, so jarring, that I almost jumped out of my chair. At first, I thought it was a mechanical error, a short in the equipment. But as I adjusted the dial, the signal didn't change. It just grew louder. It was a chaotic mess of sound, a cacophony of white noise that was physically painful to my ears. I was about to turn it off when I heard something within the noise. Something human. It was a voice, a woman's voice, screaming. It wasn't just a scream. It was a shriek of absolute, bone-chilling terror. It was a raw, unfiltered expression of pure fear. My heart was pounding in my chest. The signal wasn't just a random static burst. It was a terrifying, deeply personal broadcast. I couldn't just turn it off. I had to understand it. The situation escalated when I heard another voice in the transmission. This one was a man's, low and menacing, a voice that was clearly filled with rage. He was shouting at the woman, his words a stream of anger and frustration. He wasn't just shouting, he was threatening her, his voice a cold, chilling presence in the static. I was a helpless bystander to a terrifying, senseless act of human rage. It was a live broadcast of a crime. It wasn't just an audio recording. It was a live, unfiltered, and deeply personal transmission of a terrible event. My heart was pounding in my chest, and a profound sense of helplessness washed over me. I was a witness, but I was powerless. I was listening to something that was real, something that was happening right now, but I couldn't see it. I immediately called the police, my voice shaking as I tried to explain the situation. The operator on the other end of the line was patient but skeptical. "You're listening to what?" she asked, her voice calm and professional. "Are you sure it's not a prank? A broadcast from a movie?" I insisted that it was real. I explained the technical details, the low frequency, the way the signal was coming in. But to my horror, as I was talking, the signal went dead. The screaming stopped. The menacing voice was gone. The chaotic static was gone. The channel was completely silent. The operator, now more convinced that I was making a prank call, told me to call back if I had more information. They couldn't do anything with what I had given them. Just a panicked, rambling call from a woman who heard voices in the static. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just been a witness to a terrible crime. I replayed the audio, studying the voices, searching for any clues, any identifying markers. The voices, the tone, the sheer terror in the woman's voice, it was all too real, but there was nothing else. Just a brief, terrifying glimpse into a private world. Weeks passed, and I kept expecting to hear it again, to find the source of the signal, to hear the woman's voice again. I stopped listening for old military transmissions. Now my entire focus was on a single, silent channel. Every time I heard a crackle, every time the static shifted, my heart leapt in my throat. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man's voice was still out there, that the crime had been committed. I couldn't shake the feeling that the voice I heard, the anger and the rage, was a living thing, and it was still out there, somewhere. I'm afraid that one day, my radio will pick up a new signal, something that wasn't there before, a low, menacing whisper that is speaking directly to me. Story 10. Unending Loop of the Unseen. Leo was a creature of habit. Every Saturday morning, he'd walk the 2 blocks from his apartment to the local coffee shop, a small, independent place that still used real ceramic mugs. But this particular Saturday, a detour presented itself. A garage sale. It wasn't advertised. Just a few dusty items scattered on a tarp in front of an old, neglected Victorian house. A frail, elderly woman sat on a wicker chair, her hands clasped in her lap, watching the few passers-by with a vacant stare. He approached, his curiosity piqued. The items were a strange mix: chipped teacups, yellow glazed doilies, and a small, antique music box. It was this music box that held his attention. Made of dark carved wood, it had a faded image on top of what looked like a carousel horse. He picked it up, feeling its cool weight in his palm. The woman, as if waking from a trance, spoke. Her voice was thin and raspy, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. That box, it holds melodies no one should hear, she whispered. My late husband made it, said it captured echoes of moments, little loops of time. Leo chuckled nervously. Sounds intriguing. He turned the key on the bottom. The mechanism was stiff, but with a gentle twist, a faint, melancholic tune began to play. It was beautiful, but with a strange, dissonant undertone that made the hairs on his arms stand up. He was about to ask her the price when a group of rowdy young men on skateboards careened onto the sidewalk. One of them, a lanky guy with a mess of red hair, performed a reckless trick, landing his board right on one of the teacups, shattering it. The old woman flinched, her eyes wide with fear. The red-haired youth just laughed. Oops, guess it was already broken, huh, Grandma? The old woman's composure crumbled. Please, just go. I don't want any trouble, she pleaded. Another teenager, a bulky guy with a sneer, kicked a pile of books, sending them flying into the street. The woman tried to stand, but her legs were shaky. That book, it was my husband's favorite. Please, she begged. The bulky teenager scoffed. What's wrong? Can't afford new ones? He then grabbed a porcelain figurine of a bird from the tarp and pretended to juggle it, before dropping it with a sickening crash. The old woman let out a small sigh. Leo felt a surge of anger and was about to intervene, but the memory of a past confrontation, a moment of misplaced bravado that ended in a bruised ego and a night in the hospital, held him back. The shame of his inaction was a bitter taste in his mouth. The bulky teenager noticed his hesitation. A cruel smile spread across his face as he sauntered over to Leo. What's the matter, tough guy? Not gonna do anything? The other teen snickered. Leo felt his blood run cold. He was trapped, frozen in place by his own fear. The red-haired teenager then grabbed the old woman's cane and snapped it in half over his name. The woman slumped back into her chair, defeated. The group then turned their attention to the last remaining items on the tarp, methodically destroying each one. The sound of ceramic breaking, wood splintering, and paper tearing filled the air. Leo watched, clutching the music box, unable to move. Just as the group started to kick the tarp itself, a police siren wailed in the distance. The teenagers scattered, leaping onto their skateboards and disappearing around the corner. The street was left silent, littered with the broken remnants of a life. The old woman sat there, shaking, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. When the police arrived, they took statements. Leo, still holding the music box, approached the old woman, who was now being helped by a kind neighbor. He tried to give the box back to her. She looked at him with an unsettlingly blank expression and pushed his hand away. Keep it, she rasped. You'll need it more than I do. That night, Leo's sleep was restless. He dreamed of the garage sale, but with a chilling twist. The music box was open, and he saw himself standing there watching the scene unfold, but he was one of the teenagers. He was the one breaking the items, the one laughing, while the real Leo stood by, horrified, a helpless witness to his own monstrous actions. The old woman simply watched, a faint, knowing smile on her face, and the music box played its dissonant tune, a melody of his shame and fear, an endless loop he couldn't escape. He woke up in a cold sweat, the music box still clutched in his hand, a feeling of dread settling deep in his bones. He knew, with an unshakable certainty, that the dream wasn't just a dream. It was a memory, or worse, a warning. Story 11. The Faded Blueprint. I stumbled upon it during a cold, late autumn evening. My job as a freelance archivist often led me to dusty, forgotten places, but the old warehouse on the edge of town was a different beast altogether. It was slated for demolition, and the city council had hired me to sift through any historical documents before the bulldozers moved in. The air inside was thick with the scent of decay and damp concrete, and the only light came from the weak beam of my headlamp. After days of cataloging mundane financial records and faded shipping manifests, I was ready to call it quits. That's when I found a small, unmarked crate tucked away in a shadowed corner. It was surprisingly heavy and felt solid, not like the rotting wood of the other containers. Inside, nestled among a layer of shredded canvas, was a rolled-up blueprint. It felt unusually cool to the touch, and as I unrolled it, a faint metallic odor filled the air. The blueprint wasn't of a building as I'd expected, but of some kind of complex machine. Its title, written in elegant, spidery script, read, "The Chronos Resonator." The drawings were intricate and beautiful, detailing gears and strange, overlapping coils, in a way that seemed almost artistic. However, it was the details on the side that truly caught my attention. There were equations, not the kind I recognized from school, and a series of notes scribbled in the margins. Synchronization point, temporal loop, observer paradox. The terms were alien to me, yet they resonated with an unsettling familiarity. A strange, low hum seemed to vibrate from the paper itself, a sensation so subtle I initially dismissed it as my imagination or the wind whistling through the broken windows. I felt a thrill of discovery, a genuine sense of finding something extraordinary. I carefully tucked the blueprint into my bag and left the warehouse, the weight of it feeling strangely significant. Back in my small apartment, I laid the document flat on my desk. The longer I stared at it, the more the cryptic symbols and equations seemed to shift, almost as if they were alive. I tried a simple search online for Chronos Resonator, expecting to find nothing. Instead, a handful of results popped up from obscure, long-abandoned forums. One in particular, on a forgotten message board about fringe science and historical anomalies, had a thread titled, "The Labyrinthine Blueprints." The first post described finding a similar blueprint, and the replies were a chilling progression of the original posters unraveling. "The hum, it's getting louder," one post read. "The world, it's looping. I'm seeing myself do things I haven't done yet." My heart hammered against my ribs. The post stopped abruptly after that. A private message blinked in my inbox. It was from a user who hadn't posted in years, someone with the cryptic handle Archivist of Time. The message was short and direct. "The blueprints are not plans. They are an echo. Do not try to understand them. You are already part of the system now. You must sever the connection." The words sent a shiver down my spine. How could this person know? My anxiety morphed into outright panic. I took the blueprint and hid it in the back of my closet, shoving it under a pile of old blankets. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, humming, its equations pulsing with a quiet, menacing energy. The next day, I started experiencing strange phenomena. I'd walk into a room and feel as though I had just left it. I'd reach for a coffee mug and feel a phantom sensation of it already being in my hand. It was a subtle, disturbing form of déjà vu that grew more pronounced with each passing hour. I messaged the person back, my fingers trembling on the keyboard. They responded with a series of vague but ominous warnings. The blueprint is a key. It doesn't create a loop, it reveals one. The resonance is not a sound, it's a feeling. A memory of a future that has already happened. They told me to dispose of it, but not just to throw it away. Burn it, disperse the ashes. You can't just throw it in the trash. Its resonance will continue to contaminate its surroundings. I was scared, but I knew I had to follow their advice. I took the blueprint, drove to a remote section of the woods, and tried to burn it. The paper resisted the flame, scorching at the edges, but refusing to ignite fully. A deep dread settled over me. No matter what I did, the paper wouldn't catch fire. It was as if it was already woven into the fabric of reality, impossible to remove. I eventually gave up, leaving the singed document in a pile of fallen leaves. Over the following weeks, my life became a series of unsettling repetitions. I would be walking home and suddenly find myself at the beginning of the same street. I would answer a phone call and realize I was hearing the exact same conversation I had just had a minute before. Was it all in my head? A side effect of stress and my own overactive imagination? The strange echo in my life continued, and I found myself living the same day, or a version of it, over and over again. Each loop infinitesimally different from the last. The world wasn't a static loop, it was a helix, twisting and turning, always coming back to the same point, but at a slightly different height. The blueprint wasn't a warning, it was a blueprint for my future. It was a roadmap of a life I was already living, one I would never be able to escape. I never heard from Archivist of Time again. I sometimes wonder if they were real, or just another part of the pattern, another echo in a world that had become a terrifying, endless loop. The hum from the paper is no longer a feeling. I can hear it now. It's the sound of the world's gears, and I am a cog in a machine I don't understand. Story 12. A Harmless Curiosity. The air in the old forgotten bookshop was thick with the scent of aging paper and dust. Elias, a meticulous archivist in his late 20s, had just inherited the place from his reclusive grandaunt, Eleanor. He wasn't a man of sentiment. He saw the shop as a project, a place to catalog and organize, bringing order to the chaos of someone else's life. His grandaunt, a woman he barely knew, had been known for her eccentricities, her final years spent surrounded by stacks of books no one else would touch. One damp Tuesday afternoon, while sorting through a stack of rare 19th century manuscripts, he found it. A small, unassuming wooden box tucked away in a hollowed-out dictionary. It was locked, with no visible keyhole, just a series of intricate carved symbols on its lid. The symbols were unfamiliar, resembling a strange blend of ancient runes and modern circuitry. Curiosity, a rare visitor in Elias's methodical life, took hold. He spent hours trying to decipher them, feeling a growing sense of unease with each passing moment. The symbols seemed to shift and change in the flickering lamplight, and the box felt unnaturally cold to the touch. The next day, the disturbances began. Elias's perfectly organized shelves of books seemed to have been rearranged overnight. A rare edition of Poe's Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque was no longer in its usual spot, but sat on his desk, open to a page with a cryptic passage underlined in what looked like his grandaunt's shaky handwriting. The words were a nonsensical jumble, but their underlying tone was one of chilling despair. It felt like a subtle taunt, a disruption of the very order he was trying to impose. Elias dismissed it as his own absent-mindedness, a mistake he made in his haste to close the shop the night before. But the feeling of being watched lingered, a quiet, unsettling presence in the silence of the old shop. The disturbances escalated. That night, as he sat at home, poring over the box, his apartment was flooded with a strange, high-pitched static. It wasn't coming from his electronics. It seemed to be everywhere at once, a buzzing in his teeth and bones. Then his phone rang. The caller ID was a string of random numbers. When he answered, the line was silent for a moment before a distorted, mechanical voice whispered, "The order is broken." The voice was not hostile, but its detached, almost clinical tone sent a shiver down his spine. Elias immediately hung up, the words echoing in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was connected to the box. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences became more direct and unnerving. One evening, he returned to the shop to find the front window spray painted with the same bizarre symbols from the box. The message wasn't threatening, but it was a clear violation of his space, a public display of this private horror. The local police had no leads, and Elias felt a growing sense of isolation and paranoia. It was as if this strange force was systematically dismantling his sense of reality, one unsettling event at a time. The final terrifying blow came in the mail. A small package arrived, containing a single, brittle page torn from a book. The page was covered in the same strange symbols, and the smell of the paper was overwhelmingly, sickeningly familiar. It was the same smell as the old bookshop. It was the smell of his grandaunt's books, but with a faint metallic undertone, like blood. Elias was now certain. The box was not an inheritance. It was an activation. He realized the symbols were not just a lock. They were a sequence, a call to something he couldn't comprehend. He reached out to an old colleague, a linguist named Lena, who specialized in obscure languages. She was initially skeptical, but agreed to look at the photos of the symbols. A few days later, her tone had changed. She sounded terrified. The symbols, she explained, were part of an ancient pre-human communication system. A set of instructions for a ritual, a protocol for inviting something into this world. Her research had revealed a horrifying detail. The box was a nexus, and Elias's obsessive focus on it had opened a channel. The strange voice, the rearranged books, the spray-painted symbols, they weren't random acts of harassment. They were a systematic recalibration of his life, a preparation for something much, much worse. The protocol was nearing its completion. Elias, in a state of utter panic, tried to get rid of the box, but he couldn't. It seemed to have become a part of the shop, a fixed point he couldn't move. He lived in a state of constant dread, the silence of the shop now a torment rather than a comfort. He never saw a human face, never heard a normal voice. He only saw the strange symbols appear in new, impossible places, and heard the distant, distorted whispers of a protocol that was not his own. The world around him had become an extension of the box's influence, a reality molded by an unknown force, and he, the unwitting archivist, was now a permanent part of the collection. He was trapped in a nightmare of his own making, a prison of logic and order twisted into something unspeakable. The finality of his fate, that he had brought this upon himself through a simple act of curiosity, was the most terrifying horror of all. He had sought to bring order to chaos, only to become the central piece of a chaos far greater than he could have ever imagined. Story 13. A Voice in the Static. The old radio sat in the dusty corner of my grandfather's workshop, a relic from an era before streaming and satellites. Its walnut casing was chipped and worn, and the brass dials were tarnished with age. I found it while cleaning out the workshop after he passed away, a bittersweet task I'd been putting off for months. My grandfather, a man of simple pleasures and deep curiosities, had spent countless hours tinkering with old electronics. This radio, a 1940s model with a glowing vacuum tube display, seemed to be his final unfinished project. I decided to take it home, a tangible link to his memory. I'm a historian, not an engineer. My job involves sifting through old documents, not repairing broken circuits. But I was determined to get the radio working. It felt like a way to honor him. I spent a week watching YouTube tutorials and meticulously following wiring diagrams I found online. After a few false starts and a small electric shock, the old radio crackled to life. Static hissed from the speaker, a white noise that was somehow comforting in its familiarity. I began to tune the dials, searching for a station. I expected to find nothing but static or at best a few distant AM signals. But then I heard a voice. It was faint at first, a woman's voice, speaking with a strange clipped cadence. It sounded like an old, archived broadcast, but the content was chillingly personal. "He's still here," the voice whispered through the static. "I see him in the reflection." I quickly tuned away, my heart pounding. It must have been a fluke, a stray signal from a local radio hobbyist, I told myself. But the unsettling feeling lingered. Over the next few days, I became obsessed with the radio. I would turn it on late at night, in the quiet of my apartment, and tune the dials slowly. I started a logbook, meticulously recording the frequencies where I heard the voices. They were always different, and they always spoke in hushed tones, as if sharing a secret. A man's voice, raspy and strained, said, "They're watching me from the windows. They never close their eyes." Another, a child's voice, whimpered, "The shadows are getting closer. They want me to play." The messages were cryptic, fragmented, and always profoundly unsettling. They weren't just random sounds. They were slices of genuine fear, raw and intimate. The radio became my own personal secret. I didn't tell my friends or family. They would have dismissed it as my grief playing tricks on me, a symptom of spending too much time alone in the workshop. But I knew it was real. The messages felt too authentic, too unnerving to be a simple radio hoax. I started to notice a pattern. The voices seemed to be describing impossible situations, imprisonment in a place with no doors, an unending sense of being watched, and an inescapable dread that permeated every word. I became convinced that these were not broadcasts from a physical location, but something else entirely. Something from a place that existed outside of our normal reality. My research shifted from radio repair to something far more esoteric. I delved into old books on forgotten radio theory and paranormal phenomena. I learned about ghost boxes, devices that supposedly captured voices from the spirit world by rapidly scanning radio frequencies. My grandfather's old radio didn't seem to be a ghost box in the traditional sense, but it was behaving like one. The more I listened, the more I felt like I was crossing a line, venturing into a world I wasn't meant to see. One night, the static changed. It became a low hum, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through the floorboards. I tuned the dial to a frequency I'd never heard a voice on before. The sound grew louder, more defined, and I heard something that froze the blood in my veins. It was a single, clear voice, a woman's voice, but it was different from the others. It was calm, almost serene, and it said my name. "Liam," she said, her voice like a bell in the night. "You shouldn't have turned on the radio." I slammed the dial, twisting it until it clicked off. The hum stopped, But the silence that followed was even more terrifying. The radio had known my name. How was that possible? My grandfather had given me the radio before he died, but I'd never told anyone about it. The voice wasn't just a recording, it was aware of me. The thought sent a jolt of ice through me. This wasn't some random radio show. This was a direct, chilling communication. I felt a paralyzing fear I had never experienced before. It wasn't the fear of a ghost or a monster. It was the fear of being seen by something that shouldn't be able to see me. The next night, I was drawn back to the radio, as if by an invisible thread. I felt a desperate need to understand, to find an answer, to close the door on whatever I had opened. I turned the radio on, and again the hum filled the room. This time, I didn't tune the dials. I just listened. The voices came through, one after another, each more chilling than the last. But they were different. They weren't just describing their fear. They were talking to me. "He's listening," a voice whispered. "He's so close to us now." Another added, "Don't tell him how to get out. Don't show him the way." I realized with a sickening lurch that the voices weren't victims trapped in some unknown space. They were beings trying to escape, and my radio, my grandfather's old, beautiful radio, was a gateway, a window into their world. Every time I turned it on, every time I listened, I was helping them find their way out, and they were using my curiosity, my need for an answer, to lure me in. I sat there, frozen, listening to the cacophony of pleas and warnings. The voices were a chorus of despair, their desperation palpable. "He's coming," a child's voice shrieked. "He found a new way." The hum intensified, the static a living, breathing thing. I finally understood the terrifying implication. The voices weren't just coming from the radio. They were coming through it, and the more I listened, the closer they got. I saw a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. A shadow on the wall, not cast by any light in the room, seemed to pulse, to stretch, to grow. I slammed the radio to the floor, the glass tube display shattering with a pop and a hiss. The hum vanished, replaced by a sudden deafening silence. I stood there, trembling, the broken radio at my feet. Had I stopped them, or had the static already found a way out? I'll never know for sure. I'm a historian, and I believe in evidence. But sometimes the most terrifying truths are the ones that defy all explanation. I've since moved, and the old radio is long gone. But every time I hear the hiss of static on a broken television or the low hum of a distant transformer, I wonder if the voices found another gateway, another soul driven by curiosity. And I wonder if they're calling my name again. Story 14. The Watchmaker's Regret. He lived in a quiet, secluded town in New England, a place of gentle hills and ancient stone walls. He was a man of routine, with a quiet life filled with the methodical ticking of antique clocks. His solitude was a chosen one, a peaceful existence away from the chaos of modern life. His peaceful routine was interrupted by a local community event, an antique fair held in the town square. Adam, drawn by the promise of rare timepieces, went with a quiet sense of anticipation. As he was browsing a stall filled with old tools and forgotten trinkets, his attention was caught by a peculiar object. It was a small, ornate clock with no hands, its face replaced by a series of strange, unsettling symbols. It wasn't a clock he had ever seen before. The craftsmanship was masterful, but the symbols were alien, almost malicious in their design. He felt an intense pull towards it, a fascination that bordered on obsession. He bought the clock from the vendor, a young man who seemed eager to be rid of it. The vendor explained that he had inherited it from a distant relative, a reclusive man who had lived in the town's old lighthouse. The vendor seemed nervous, almost relieved to see it go. Adam returned to his workshop, the strange clock feeling heavy in his hands. He meticulously examined it, his skilled fingers tracing the unsettling symbols. He noticed a small, hidden mechanism at the base of the clock. He used a series of miniature screwdrivers to carefully open it. Inside, he found a single, handwritten note, folded into a tight square. The note was not old, but the ink was faded, as if it had been exposed to light for a long time. It was a cryptic message. He saw what was coming, and he tried to stop it. Now he's just a part of the machine. Adam felt a profound sense of dread. The note didn't just feel like a warning. It felt like a confession. He returned to the vendor, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and curiosity. He asked about the previous owner, the man from the lighthouse. The vendor was reluctant to talk, but under Adam's persistent questioning, he finally revealed a few unsettling details. The man, a renowned cartographer, had become increasingly paranoid in his last years. He had claimed that he could see the future in the movements of the stars, but what he saw wasn't events, but a series of interconnected tragedies. The vendor had always dismissed it as the ramblings of a man gone mad. Adam, with his mind for patterns and his meticulous nature, began to connect the dots. The unsettling symbols on the clock, the cryptic note, the cartographer's madness. It all pointed to a larger, more sinister reality. He realized that the clock wasn't just a timepiece. It was a map, a guide to a series of intertwined, fated events. The symbols on its face corresponded to specific locations in the town, each one the site of a past tragedy. He spent days poring over old town records, finding that each symbol was linked to a specific and seemingly random disaster: a house fire, a sudden rock slide, a tragic fall from a bridge. He felt a wave of icy terror wash over him as he realized that the clock was not just a record of these events, but a part of them, an object that had been present at each tragedy. The climax of his terror came when he noticed a new terrifying detail on the clock's face. A small, new symbol, carved with a different, more recent hand, had been added. The symbol pointed directly to his own street, his own house. It wasn't a record of the past, but a prophecy of the future. The last person who owned the clock, the cartographer, had tried to stop a series of tragedies and had failed, becoming a part of the machine himself. The note wasn't just a warning. It was a desperate plea from a man who had seen the terrifying truth and had been consumed by it. Adam realized with a chilling certainty that the clock was not a passive object, but a catalyst, a tool designed to bring about the very tragedies it documented. It was a curse, and he, in his naive curiosity, had become the next victim. Adam was faced with a horrifying dilemma. He could destroy the clock, shattering the cursed object and hoping to break the chain of tragic events. Or he could try to decipher the symbols to understand the mechanism behind the curse and perhaps, just perhaps, find a way to stop it. He looked at the clock, the new symbol seeming to glow with a faint, malevolent light, and he knew that the choice was not his alone. The clock was a part of him now, a constant ticking reminder of the fate that awaited him. He felt a profound sense of dread and paranoia, knowing he was already in too deep. He could hear the faint, almost imperceptible ticking of a clock that had no hands, and he knew his time was running out. Story 15. The Scribe's Curse. Alara Vance, a 28-year-old freelance editor, had just moved into an old, three-story Victorian house in the historic, rain-soaked town of Blackwood Creek. The house was a monument to a forgotten era, with creaking floors, high ceilings, and a musty smell of age and forgotten stories. Alara, a woman with a sharp mind and an insatiable curiosity for the macabre, saw it as the perfect sanctuary for her work. Her motivation was simple: to find a place that would inspire her writing and give her peace away from the sterile and modern city she had left behind. Her new life of tranquil solitude was shattered by the discovery of a peculiar artifact. While organizing the dusty attic, she found a small antique writing desk. Inside one of its hidden compartments was a leather-bound journal. It was old, the cover worn smooth, with no title or author. The pages within were filled with cramped, elegant handwriting. The contents were a strange mix of observations and unsettling, fragmented prophecies. The journal seemed to describe a series of unfortunate events, all of which had already happened. The entries were all dated in a very specific, sequential manner and seemed to be the musings of a man with an uncanny foresight. Alara felt a shiver run down her spine as she read a description of a fire that had consumed a local building just last month, and a recent landslide on a nearby highway. The details in the journal were too specific to be a coincidence. The real horror began when she found a new entry, written in a different, more recent hand. The script was frantic and messy, and it described a series of mundane, day-to-day events in her life. It mentioned the specific kind of tea she drank that morning, and the song she had been humming while she worked. The entry was undated, but it felt terrifyingly fresh. The journal wasn't just a record of past events. It was a living, breathing record of her own life, written by someone else. She felt a profound sense of violation, a chilling sensation of being watched, of her life being meticulously documented by an unknown author. Alara's paranoia intensified. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being observed, and every time she looked at the journal, she felt a wave of dread. She tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it as a prank or a strange coincidence, but the feeling of being a character in someone else's story was suffocating. She started closing the curtains, locking the doors, and checking her surroundings, convinced that the scribe was nearby. Her meticulous and organized life began to unravel. She couldn't focus on her work, and her sleep was plagued by unsettling dreams of being watched. The climax of her fear came when she found a new, horrifying entry. It wasn't about her daily routine. It described an event yet to happen, a small, seemingly insignificant detail from her future. The entry read, "She will find the rusted key, and with it she will open the door to her own undoing." Alara found a small, rusted key in the pocket of her coat, a coat she hadn't worn in weeks. She had no idea how it got there, and the discovery sent a wave of icy terror through her. The journal wasn't just observing her, it was actively shaping her reality. It was a tool, a curse, that was guiding her towards an unknown and undoubtedly terrible fate. Alara's mind raced. She knew she had to find the source of the journal. She couldn't just throw it away. It was too personal, too deeply connected to her. She meticulously reread the journal, searching for any clues about the scribe who had left it. She found a fragmented, scribbled note on the very last page, a plea from the last person who had owned the journal. It was a warning, a desperate cry for help. It spoke of a person who had become obsessed with him, a reclusive man who believed that by documenting someone's life, he could take control of it. The note mentioned his name, but it was smudged and illegible. She called her friend Liam, a journalist with a knack for research. She told him about the journal, the entries, and the terrifying new prophecy. He was skeptical at first, but after she read him some of the entries, he began to believe her. He went to the local library and looked up the history of her house and the previous owners. He discovered that the last person to live there was a reclusive author who had a reputation for being obsessed with his subjects. He had died in the house a few months ago, and all his belongings had been sold at an estate sale. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The journal wasn't just a record, it was a part of the author's twisted legacy, a way for him to continue his macabre work even after death. Ilara realized that she wasn't just a character in his story. She was the last chapter, the final subject he had chosen. And she knew that the only way to break the curse was to find the last piece of the puzzle, the lock that the rusted key belonged to. The journal was not a gift of foresight. It was a chain, a trap designed to lead her to her own demise. She looked at the key in her hand, the rust now seeming to glow with a faint, malevolent light. And she knew she had a decision to make: to follow the curse to its end, or to fight back against the unseen force that was controlling her life. Story 16. Uninvited Guests. The old lighthouse stood on a rocky outcrop, its beams sweeping across the churning sea. It was a lonely life, but for Arthur, it was the only one he knew. A retired cartographer in his late 60s, he had traded the meticulously drawn maps of his past for the rhythm of the waves and the solitary watch over the coast. His only companions were the gulls and the distant, mournful foghorns. He wasn't running from anything. He was simply drawn to the quiet and the order of the tides. His days were a peaceful cycle of maintenance, reading, and documenting the weather. One blustery Thursday, a peculiar package washed ashore. Arthur was on his morning walk along the shingle beach, a daily ritual to clear his mind. He spotted a strange rectangular object partially buried in the sand, its smooth, dark surface contrasting with the rough stones. He carefully dug it out. It was a small, ornate wooden chest, no bigger than a shoebox, with intricate carvings of interlocking vines and a single tarnished brass lock. It smelled faintly of sea salt and something else, something musty, like old paper. There was no name, no address, just the relentless pounding of the waves that had delivered it. The find was a strange thrill for Arthur, a break from the monotony of his quiet existence. He carried it back to the lighthouse, his curiosity outweighing his caution. He placed the chest on his worn oak table. The lock, surprisingly, yielded easily to a firm twist, and the lid creaked open with a protesting groan. Inside, he found a collection of old, delicate items wrapped in a piece of faded silk. There was a small, tarnished silver locket, a rusted key, a few brittle leaves, and a meticulously kept journal. The pages were yellowed and fragile, filled with flowing cursive script. He picked up the journal, his hands trembling slightly with anticipation. The first entry was dated over a century ago. It was the diary of a young woman named Emma, who had lived on this very coast. Her first few entries were mundane, filled with observations about the weather and her longing for a life beyond the sea. But as Arthur turned the pages, a sense of unease began to build. Emma's writings grew darker, more frantic. She described a shadow, a presence that had followed her family to their remote cottage. It was a subtle thing at first, a feeling of being watched, the whisper of her name on the wind, the soft rustle of leaves when no breeze stirred. Then, the events became more tangible. Items would be moved, doors found ajar, and faint cold drafts would seep through the walls. She wrote of a persistent dread, a feeling of not being alone. But what truly chilled Arthur was the detail in her descriptions. She meticulously documented the uninvited guests, her term for the strange phenomenon. She wrote of a shadow that danced in the corner of her eye and footsteps that echoed where there should be none. The more he read, the more he felt a growing sense of paranoia, a feeling that someone was standing just outside his peripheral vision. Arthur read through the night, his initial excitement replaced by a suffocating dread. The last entry was brief and terrifying. The guests have taken a seat at the table. They're laughing. I don't know why, but I know they are. The handwriting was jagged and panicked, as if scrawled in a moment of pure terror. The final page was blank, the tale abruptly ending. Arthur closed the journal, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked up, his gaze sweeping across his small living room. The familiar shadows of the furniture seemed to writhe, and the steady rhythm of the lighthouse beam seemed to mock him, highlighting every empty space. He tried to rationalize it, a vivid story from a bygone era, nothing more. But the details were too specific, too personal. It wasn't just a tale of ghosts. It was a chronicle of psychological unraveling, a slow descent into madness. He put the chest and its contents away, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. He found himself checking the windows, looking over his shoulder, and listening for sounds that weren't there. The following day, he noticed a small, peculiar detail. The brass lock on the chest was no longer tarnished. It gleamed as if it had been polished. He hadn't touched it since he'd opened it. A wave of ice-cold fear washed over him. The logical part of his mind told him it was the sea salt and moisture, but a more primitive, panicked part told him otherwise. He tried to dismiss it, to go about his routine, but every hour brought a new, unsettling discovery. A book on his shelf was no longer in its place. A cup in the kitchen was moved a few inches. The small trinkets on his desk were rearranged into a strange, unidentifiable pattern. He felt like a pawn in a game he didn't understand. The psychological pressure was immense. He wasn't seeing specters or hearing voices, but the quiet evidence of their presence was far more effective. It was the slow, insidious violation of his personal space, the knowledge that something was in his home, touching his things. The uninvited guests. The name echoed in his mind, and he felt a profound, chilling connection to Emma. She had been tormented by this too. He considered throwing the chest back into the sea, but something held him back. He felt a sense of responsibility, as if he had been chosen to witness this haunting. One night, as a storm raged outside, Arthur woke from a fitful sleep. The wind howled, and the rain lashed against the tower. He heard a soft sound from the living room. It wasn't a creak or a groan from the old structure, but a distinct, rhythmic tapping. He lay in bed, his muscles tensed, listening. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and it seemed to be coming from the chest. He crept out of his room, flashlight in hand, and peered into the living room. The tapping had stopped, but a new sound had taken its place, a low, rhythmic scraping. The chest was sitting on the floor, its contents scattered around it. The journal was open, and the rusty key was slowly being dragged across the page, carving a new word. He watched, frozen with terror, as the key etched a single word onto the blank page, over and over again. Welcome. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was a deafening scream. Arthur backed away slowly, his mind reeling. The open-ended nature of the events, the lack of a grand reveal, was what made it so terrifying. It was a psychological war of attrition, and he had just lost the first battle. He was no longer a lonely man on a lonely coast. He was the new host to a family of uninvited guests. Story 17, The Unseen Audience. The summer was a haze of sticky heat and stagnant air. For Arthur, it was the perfect backdrop for his current state of mind, broke, uninspired, and clinging to the frayed edges of a dream. He was a musician, or at least he had been before the gigs dried up and the bills piled high. The move to this new apartment was a last-ditch effort, a desperate attempt to find a cheaper place to live, and a new creative spark. The building was old, a 3-story brick structure with peeling paint and creaky floors. His unit was on the top floor, a cramped space with one large window overlooking a rusted fire escape. The landlord had warned him that the previous tenant, an elderly projectionist, had left some things behind. "Mostly junk," he'd said with a dismissive wave. Arthur just nodded, eager to get the keys and settle in. The first few weeks were a blur of unpacking and attempting to write. The guitar sat in the corner, a silent reproach. The apartment, with its musty smell and the persistent hum of the old refrigerator, felt less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb for his ambitions. It was during one particularly frustrating evening, a storm brewing outside, that he stumbled upon it. He was moving a wobbly bookcase the landlord had left behind when something slid out from the back. It was a small, leather-bound case, tucked away in a dusty alcove. He picked it up, feeling its strange weight and the surprisingly smooth texture of the old leather. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single unlabeled film reel. It looked ancient, the celluloid brittle and yellowed with age. His curiosity piqued. He took the reel to the coffee table and wiped away the dust. There was no single marking on it, no name or date, just a small, circular metal can holding a coiled ribbon of film. It was the kind of find that you usually saw in old movies. After a moment's hesitation, he grabbed his laptop and searched for a local business that could digitize old film. He found a small family-owned place on the other side of town and decided that he would take it there first thing in the morning. Maybe it was an old home movie or a forgotten masterpiece. A forgotten anything would be more interesting than his current life. The next day, Arthur delivered the film to the shop. The owner, a man with a graying beard and a pair of thick glasses, looked at it with a practiced eye. "This is a rare kind of film," he said, turning it over in his hands. "Looks like an old 8mm. Might be difficult to transfer without damaging it." Arthur insisted, offering to pay extra for the careful work. A few days later, he received an email with a link to a digital file. He settled into his chair, a fresh cup of coffee in hand, and clicked play. The film began with a sputter of static and a jumpy image. The footage was grainy and black and white, shot in what looked like a dark, dusty room. The camera panned slowly, revealing a stage set up with a single microphone and a simple wooden chair. It was a humble, intimate setting, a space clearly meant for a performance. Then a figure entered the frame. It was a man, dressed in a simple, worn suit, carrying a violin. He was gaunt and had a somber expression on his face. He sat down on the chair, adjusted the violin on his shoulder, and began to play. The music was a sorrowful, haunting melody. It wasn't a familiar tune, but it was deeply moving and unsettling at the same time. The camera stayed focused on the man's face, his eyes closed in concentration, a single tear rolling down his cheek. As the film progressed, a strange feeling began to creep up on Arthur. The performance wasn't just a concert. It felt like an intimate ritual. There was an eerie stillness to the room. No applause, no audience, just the lone musician and the camera. The music grew in intensity, the notes swirling into a crescendo of anguish and despair. Then, abruptly, the film ended. The screen went black and Arthur was left in silence. He felt a deep unease, a sense of having witnessed something he wasn't meant to see. Over the next few nights, the feeling lingered. He couldn't shake the image of the violinist and his sorrowful tune. He tried to write, but all he could think about was that melody. It started to replay in his mind, first as a whisper, then as a full-blown song. He felt compelled to recreate it. He spent hours at his piano, his fingers fumbling over the keys, trying to capture the elusive notes. He was so focused that he didn't notice the strange things happening around him. The subtle shifts in the shadows, the cold spots in the room, the faint, rhythmic sound of a tapping on the floor. He dismissed them as the building settling, or his imagination playing tricks on him. But finally, he felt like he had captured the essence of the melody. He was excited, his creative energy finally surging back to life. He set up his recording equipment, ready to lay down the track. As he played, the music filled the apartment, resonating with an almost unnatural clarity. He was completely absorbed, his eyes closed, his fingers dancing across the keys. When he finished, he opened his eyes and froze. Standing in the corner, partially obscured by the darkness, was a figure. It was the man from the film reel, the violinist. He was transparent, a ghostly apparition with the same gaunt face and somber expression. He wasn't playing the violin, but the air was thick with the faint scent of old wood and rosin. Arthur stared, his heart pounding in his chest, unable to move or make a sound. The figure just stood there, watching him with those same sorrowful eyes. A wave of dread washed over him. This wasn't a hallucination. This was real. He had brought something into his home, something dark and sorrowful. He scrambled to his feet, knocking over the music stand. The figure didn't move. Arthur ran out of the room, fumbling with the doorknob, and burst out into the hallway, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He stayed in the hallway for what felt like an eternity, his mind racing. When he finally mustered the courage to go back in, the figure was gone. The apartment was exactly as he had left it. The only evidence of his panic, the overturned music stand, and the cold dread still clinging to his skin. He tried to convince himself it was a product of his overactive imagination. He was stressed, sleep-deprived, and lonely. But the image of the violinist was seared into his mind. He couldn't go back to his routine. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He started to notice more things. The door to his bedroom, which he was sure he had closed, would be ajar. The old radio in the living room would turn on by itself, emitting a low, mournful static. He began to sleep with the lights on, his guitar leaning against the wall like a useless weapon. One night, unable to sleep, he pulled out his laptop and re-watched the film. He scrutinized every frame, looking for a clue. He focused on the details he had missed before. The single chair, the microphone, the empty stage. But this time, something new caught his eye. In the background, just barely visible in the shadows, was another figure. A faint outline of a person sitting in a chair, and another and another. It wasn't an empty room. The room was filled with people, all of them silent, still, and watching the violinist. An audience of unseen watchers, bound to the performance. A terrible realization dawned on him. The violinist wasn't just playing for the camera. He was playing for them. And now, Arthur was part of the audience. The tapping sound he had heard before began again, louder now. It was coming from the other side of his apartment, the far wall. The sound was rhythmic, like a metronome, counting out the beat of a silent, invisible performance. He ran to the wall and pressed his ear against it, but the sound stopped. He was losing his mind. He had to get out of there. He had to destroy the film, sever the connection. He grabbed his laptop, his hands trembling, and found the digital file. He right-clicked and selected Delete. A pop-up appeared, asking him to confirm. He pressed yes. The file disappeared, but the tapping didn't stop. It began again, faster this time. It was everywhere. On the walls, on the floor, on the ceiling. A chorus of unseen fingers, a silent applause. He stumbled back, his eyes darting around the room, a profound terror gripping him. He had deleted the file, but he couldn't delete the memory. The performance had been imprinted on his mind, and now he was the one trapped in the spotlight. The last thing he saw before everything went dark was his own reflection in the window, his face contorted in a silent scream. And for a fleeting moment, he saw it just behind his shoulder, a faint, blurry face in the darkness, watching. An audience member. An audience member with the same gaunt face and sorrowful eyes.